Okay, folks, welcome back to segment 2 in our Get Centered episode on the Renaissance or Rebirth. If you'll check out Rodney Waters, his portion on symbols and tattoos, I'll make a couple references to his work and hang out after this about 10-minute lecture that I'll do for a panel discussion for everybody to chime in on thoughts. So I want to talk about a cycle because, when the idea of the Renaissance came up, I went to two scholars in particular, Cariani and Mircea Eliade, these two religious scholars that look at mythology. And in one book in particular called The Myth of the Eternal Return, it's one of Mircea Eliade's books, and he references it as one of his most important works, despite the fact that 10 years after he wrote it, he would change it. Still, he maintains it's one of his most important works, partially because what he's looking at is the essence of patterns that we human beings experience. And despite the fact that we would like to think that we can transcend nature and reality, we really can't. We're kind of bound in this, we're bound to this life. And yet in that binding, we also have a part of our consciousness that can envision itself outside of or transcendental to the existence of our existence. And in fact, consciousness is with knowing. The etymology of the term consciousness is with knowing. So one of the core patterns that we're in is that we are born and that we live and that we die, and there's a rebirth. Now, we don't know what that rebirth is all about when we're talking about literal death. There are plenty of theologians and folks who want to theorize about that. I'm not one of those. That's not my area of expertise, so I'll leave it to them. But what I do want to talk about is the symbol, back to what Rodney was talking about, of birth, life, death, and rebirth. And what we see mythically is that any myth that we resonate with, that we talk about, that is created from creation to like a creation story to the meaningful stories that we find in our cultures, that there seems to be some pattern of, number one, those stories exist. They spontaneously exist, and no matter what culture you're in. So what Jung and others posit is that existence, what anthropologists tell us, the existence of those stories helps us look beneath the surface into the deeper core of our human reality that we can't really see beyond through our own eyes and with our own ears and with our own consciousness. We have to look at history. We have to look at mythology, because as human beings, we're beholden to these patterns. And we think that time is linear, and it's not. It doesn't work that way. So myth is something that might not be literally true, but it has a truth that's deeper than what's biological or literally true. And we can look to these stories and learn aspects of what's living through us. So birth, life, death, and rebirth are mythic enacts. We can find these mythic enactments throughout our various societal rituals. And I want to talk about one core ritual. I'm going to talk about a few. But the first is that we have this ritual in psychotherapy about looking back. Right? We look back on our lives to see where we've come from. We look at our individual histories and to see what kind of forces are pushing upon us, what kind of adaptations that we've had throughout our lives. And this is an ancient practice of kind of reclaiming or respecting, to look again at what was before. Another ritual that we enact culturally is the marriage. This is an important dynamic of connection, and to be born together, to come together, to grow together, and to continue to get what Esther Perel talks about is that we are, in our adult lives, many of us are going to be in as many as 3 to 4 marriages. Sometimes that's going to be in the same marriage with the same person. But the idea is that you create this container. Rodney mentioned the wedding ring earlier. In this container, we're born, we live, and we die and are reborn. And if the two people are together, they can be reborn together and they can fall in love. And then we get this essence of the container. And what Eliade would talk about is that the marriage is in fact a mythic, it's a myth that lives through us, and we are enacting the myth. And what happens, unfortunately for us today, is that we defer a lot to our technologies. We defer a lot, what I talk about, like the window and the air conditioning and the car and the cell phone. These technologies provide us an illusion that we're somehow outside of that reality. So a lot of our rituals become stale. and we don't have the same kind of attitude of reverence and what Rodney was talking about earlier, that symbolic attitude, where we are mythically participating in an ancient process. It is not new. When I work with couples, one of the things that happens is they'll talk about the fights they get into, and I'll say something like, look, man, if I crack open the roof of any home in any period of time throughout all of human existence, you're going to hear very similar fights that exist. That is it. That is the way we work. So if we actually found a way not to be only within our perspective, but had a mythic worldview that helped us contextualize the processes that we live through, the process of death, that is not just literal. I mean, in our culture, we do a really bad job of connecting with death, because what we do is we like to hide it. We fantasize that we can avoid it. We take the elderly in our community and we separate them, and we disconnect from wisdom traditions, right? We don't allow ourselves to help to incorporate the elderly folks, the wise, the wisdom folks of our traditions, to help us understand how we can live, because they're in the position of looking back. And ancients did this much better. So rather than being involved in the mythic frame of living, we've lost our connection with that. And this is a lot of what Genesis talks about. It's a story I reference a lot, because one of the aspects of Genesis is that we're to transcend our human existence. And Leela Scott, my lovely wife, drew my attention recently to a talk that she was listening to, wherein the fellow who was talking defined nature. And I couldn't believe what she was saying, because essentially the definition was something like, nature is defined as all things that are outside of the human being. And it really underscores that's exactly what Genesis talks about, is that we're needing to take flight from the garden, and then what we're doing is we're supposed to be dominant over all the natural phenomena, rather than shepherd, rather than be with, rather than harmonize, rather than figure out ways that we can be attuned and connected, mythically speaking, because the death of God, as Nietzsche would talk about. And what he was saying is that it was the death of this attitude that we have to the forces and powers that continue to live through us, each human being in every single period of time, and will continue to do so. These are the eternals, what William Blake talked about, the eternals. In mythology, in Greek mythology, the one primary differentiator between the gods and the mortals was that the gods were immortal. They were timeless. They lived forever. And so what we say is that here I am existing on this earth, and there are powers and forces that are greater than I, that there are powers and forces greater than the I that I think I am. And so rather than believe myself to be outside of nature or higher in some kind of higher order than nature, the mythic worldview is one wherein we can begin to actually connect and represent and relate with these patterns and forces that we're beholden to. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why we suffer so greatly in our modern traditions. I mean, despite the fact that we have technologies that help us make our coffee and tea and help us phone a friend and help us do all the things that they help us do, we still suffer from anxiety. We still suffer from depression. We still suffer from hurt. We still suffer, right? So despite any of these modern technologies, the Four Noble Truths of the Buddhists is actually true. There is suffering. And the way out of suffering is an attitude. I think one of the things they were getting at is to being in a mythic space. And death and rebirth is one of the primary mythic realities that I think we need to attend to. What Tibetans do so well is that this meditation of death is a daily occurrence. And one of the things that a lot of these folks will do is every day meditate on their decaying corpse, to actually envision what your body will look like when it's covered up in worms and it's rotting, like your face is gone. And that's scary to a lot of people today, because again, we've lost this mythic attitude that helps us relate and connect to the forces that be. And psychotherapy is one of those ways that we in our culture end up doing that. It's one ritual. Right. And marriage can be one ritual. It can be a promising experience of mythically relating to the forces that be, the forces, what the God, what ancients or in religious theory, they call the hieroskamos, the sacred marriage. It's the container where we come together and we enact these processes of conflict, of support, of love, of connection, of sacrifice, of forgiveness. And if we have that attitude, obviously the marriage can be a hell of a lot better than if you're envisioning this person to be there to meet your needs or to support you financially. So part of what the idea of death and rebirth is set up to do is to get us into right relationship with the forces and powers that be, these archetypes, these original patterns, these eternals that we're beholden to. Now I want to open it up to everybody. I hope I've stirred the pot sufficiently. So let me get us back into our, hey folks.
Hi.
What, any thoughts?
I'll start. When you were talking about connecting with that death image of our own decaying corpse, I couldn't help but think of the practice of yoga. And one of the poses you tend to hold the longest is corpse pose, Shavasana.
My favorite.
Yeah, right. And it feels so good after a really intense practice or a practice at all. That finish, that completion, but to practice dying. As you said, we completely ignore it at worst, and or maybe that's at best, and we pretend like it's not going to happen at all at worst. And so to actually engage it on a daily basis or even a weekly basis, imagine the shift we would have.
Right. You remind me of the one thing I didn't say is I've got a class coming up at the Jung Center on a friend, Brian Marescu's book, The Immortality Key. And part of he's got a quote at the very beginning of the book that says, if you die before you die, you won't die when you die. And part of the myth of the eternal return is that in ancient Greece, there was this temple of Eleusis. For 2,000 years, they would go and essentially participate in a death ritual. It was the temple of Persephone and Demeter. And when Persephone goes down to the underworld, they enact this in some way. It's unknown because it was totally secret. Imagine that for 2,000 years, they kept it sacred. And that process of participating actively in a dying, or the death of ego is what we would probably call it today, helps prepare people for this kind of attitude. And I think that, again, if we had more of that, we'd certainly be better off.
It seems like in the most basic terms, you're just talking about our connection to nature, yeah. the human being's connection to nature, and that the idea of the civilization or the human being establishing an ego and coming out of the garden and out of this, that there's a kind of context in which it's necessary for our own, certainly mental well-being and physical well-being, but our very survival, for us to reimagine and to reconnect the way that we see ourselves embedded in and participating in, rather than dominating. We're in Houston. When we have hurricanes, there's no doubt who's in charge.
Plan, by the way.
It's and within a human being, the idea that the ego's really in charge is when forces come up from the unconscious and all these sorts of things, it is like a hurricane. The thought that the best we can do is humbly work in the context of nature, rather than think that we're somehow apart from it.
It makes me think of like the respect we learn to have of the ocean or of water in general, large bodies of water. You've got to respect it. And I loved being taught today that respect, of course, when you think about it, of course, it means look again, mm-hmm. Respect death, look again, it's coming. Mm-hmm. What a different awareness. And if I may, while I have your attention, I'm just going to read this Oxford Dictionary of
cool, good, yes.
reference, because it is so
Thanks upsetting. For that, by the way. It was a great tidbit.
It's so upsetting. The phenomena of the physical world collectively, including plants, animals, and the landscape, and other features and products of the earth, as opposed to
yes,
humans or human creations.
yeah.
Therein lies the problem, people.
What was the word you were defining?
Nature.
Nature. I want to key in on two words that you said, John. Consciousness. Sorry, also, Leo Scott, did I interrupt?
No.
Okay. Consciousness and respecting. Conscious respecting, I think. For me, I'm thinking about that process as somewhat of a key to this, is just a continual conscious, meaning with knowing, respecting, looking again at what's going on when it comes to the ways that the past bubbles into the future. You know, the ways that our previous experience shifts our perspective about and assumptions about what may come, about what is happening, and how we tell ourselves the story, to me is the key for this almost like a recycling of the myth, right? Of learning how to continually keep it fresh so that it doesn't do what you so very eloquently described, is becoming stale, right? It's a good word for what's happening. What happens if you hold too firm to the myth without being consciously respecting the reality, which is that this is a quick burst on Earth that we get, all of us, right? And this birth notion and death notion they're coupled. They're two sides of a coin. And so if you try to live your life in such a way that you're not understanding that there's the other side of the coin coming while you're in life, you're kind of, you're missing the point, right? You're not being conscious and you're not respecting. You're not able to do that because you're locked in. So it's interesting to me, this whole concept to me. You pepper that whole thing with so much, gold and nuggets. So it's great.
Thanks. Yeah, I was actually trying to look up Jung's definition of religion, and I couldn't find it quickly, but it is something like a watchful, careful, prudent, attentive, discerning attitude to the forces and the powers that be. So, something that's not it, but it's something like that. And so the two root here are religare and religare. Religare, I think, if I get this right, is to read again, or religare maybe to reconnect, and religare is to read again. So you have these dual concepts of to rebind or reconnect something, again, consciousness, to be with it. There's a dual like the yin and yang piece. By the way, that was my original tattoo. I was drawing yin and yangs all over my body when I was like 6. So the idea of to rebind, bring back together, to return, right? Again, that's another one. To turn again, to remember, to bring back together the parts that have been separated. All these ideas are religious. To look again and to be watchful, meaning there's a surface area reading and there's a deeper reading. And this is what Jung was talking about when he looked at the spirit of the times versus the spirit of the depths. We are these kind of meta viewers of a deeper reality. And when we're unaware of that, we suffer unconsciously. We're suffering either way, right? That's the point. Like, life is suffering, as the Buddhists tell us, and the Christians do too. And the thing, Rodney, that really, your comment about nature is that I always want to pay attention to who we hate. When somebody comes in and works with me, psychotherapy, like we talk about, who do you hate? Who do you have a negative reaction to? And you get to be conscious of how that shows up in your own life and how that may be of you. We can do that collectively too. And it is fascinating that I'm watching this show called Vikings, which is one of the best shows I've ever seen. The Christians hated the pagans, right? What was happening there? What was going on? And the pagan traditions were were based in nature. They were looking at the seasons. They were looking at aspects of religion. They were connected with the animals. There were more open and expansive views of sexuality. It was less kind of pure. And we saw a weird shift when the divine incarnated in human form. Not to go too theological here, but there are psychological aspects of that we can look at the myth and we can start to understand how that's living through us, not what was happening back then and there, but what is eternally happening right here and now that I am participating in. If I get too lost, I'm unconscious. And I'm like, yeah, I'm living a deterministic lifestyle that's been dictated to me by the powers of my early life and the forces of my current anxieties and all that, versus a more mythic understanding of I can be born and dead in my life many times. And then I can share that with my wife and she can do the same thing and I can witness her and we can participate in this sacred ritual, sacred marriage. And if we have this attitude, I don't think things are better. That's not the point. Things are deeper. Things are more powerful and more sacred. There's more potency and aliveness. And I think that's what we're seeking, right? That's something Joseph Campbell said, which was, we're not seeking meaning. We're seeking a true alive experience, the sense of being alive and vital and connected, right? That's what we want. And that's the mythic worldview, I think.